in Africa. However, because of political turmoil, then the Iron Curtain and subsequent political turmoil over the last 150 years, the Balkan region has not had sustained Paleolithic archaeology, especially published in English. So basically, everywhere we look in the region, we find evidence of ancient humans, but we don't know much about Neanderthal behavior in the region compared to Western Europe. In 2017, the second known Middle Paleolithic site in North Macedonia was discovered when an archaeological survey was done to put in a cargo airport. So from this, we found the site now known as Uzun Mera in the northeastern portion of the country. It's an open air site in a farmer's field in the center of a large agricultural valley. Neanderthals were coming to this location because of a very specific kind of stone cobble that was carried here from the highlands. Neanderthals were knocking pieces of stone together to test the fracturing properties of the rock and attempting to make tools from those of the highest quality jasper. Jasper, which is a type of flint, comes in beautiful colors, and at this location we find stone that is green, steel gray, amber, and bright red. So not only does the stone make very sharp, predictable tools, it's also attractive. So I think Neanderthals care about aesthetics as well. And from this site, we can get evidence from their decision-making process of how they're selecting materials to make stones from and all the steps in their stone tool manufacturing protocol. So this summer, we returned to Uzun Mera. We have to excavate following the farmer's rotation of the field and only can excavate in fallow fields. And we also started excavation at a new site called Peshka, which we identified last October. It's a cave site. So thinking about stratigraphy, it goes from the youngest layers to the oldest layers. So if I want to find evidence of Neanderthals, we have to go through everything that's happened before that time. So this summer we found medieval, Iron Age, 3 Bronze Age, and 1 Copper Age layers at Peshka before we had to stop for the summer. And we found things ranging from ceramics, animal bone artifacts, to features like hearths and a stone wall, even a very rare Bronze Age oven. And as that picture there in the center, we found actually Copper Age lithics in the very deepest layer, giving us hope that we'll be finding more Neolithic occupations below. So next summer, I'll be returning and looking for deeper occupations at the site of Peshka, continuing to work at Uzun Mera. Because Peshka is a rare rock shelter in an area with few caves and is located along a major waterway, it would have been a great place to stay if you were a Stone Age forager. So we're really hopeful that Peshka will be an additional data point on the landscape to give us clues about how Stone Age people were living in southeastern Europe in the past. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Next up, Chrissy Tulin, Assistant Professor of Child Development. She'll be presenting Assessing Children with Autism Spectrum Disorder, ASD.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. My name is Chrissy Tulin. I'm in Child Development. And today I wanted to present a little bit about just the general research that I have done in the past and hope to continue while here at DH, and then also a little bit about a potential new direction that I'm thinking about going in with my research. So my research is on kids who are on the autism spectrum and their families and the practical issues that are important to them. Currently, I am focused on issues that are related to the assessment of social communication behaviors. And so what do I mean by that? Social communication refers to communicating in social contexts. So that's things like using your language, your nonverbal behaviors, your facial expressions, as well as how you initiate and respond in social situations. And the reason I'm interested in that is because by definition, individuals who are on the autism spectrum have difficulty with social communication. It's part of the diagnostic criteria. And as such, there are a lot of interventions and treatments that have been developed to address this need and to improve social communication in these kids. However, the challenge is that changes in these types of behaviors are subtle. and often are really difficult to capture using a lot of the standardized measures that we use in psychology and child development. And so my research has focused on using novel assessments that capture meaningful behaviors and applying them to real world contexts. And so I work with parents and teachers and early interventionists, and I go to homes, I go to schools, centers, after school programs, and we have them do these interactive assessments so that we can actually see, like on the ground, what is the change that is, or what are the behaviors that kids are doing in these actual contexts with the people who they interact with. And hopefully we're also able to pick up a little bit of change as well. To me, this is really exciting because we are taking these assessments out of the ivory tower and giving them to people, or letting more people access them so that they can assess the change and the programs that they're doing with their kids. Okay, next is one new thing that I have been thinking about and I'm still trying to flesh out is the idea of how do individuals who are on the autism spectrum develop an autistic identity, right? How do they develop an awareness and pride in themselves as an autistic individual? But also what is happening earlier on in development in childhood and adolescence? What are the behaviors that peers and caregivers and teachers are doing that can both support and potentially act as a barrier to the development of this identity? So that's something that I'm just thinking about right now. All right, thank you.
Thank you so much, Chrissy. Next up, many thanks to Jung Kwan for filling in last minute, pulling together a presentation just today. From the philosophy department, Jung will be presenting Conundrum Regarding Aesthetic Emotions.
Thank you, Sam. Sam? Phil? Ken? A lot of it's confusing as a beginner. So I knew about this, but this introduction is included in 3 minutes, so no worries. So I heard about this 3x2 this morning. Oh, sorry. Yeah. So I heard about this 3x2 this morning, and I asked, "What is that?" So he explained to me, "Oh, that's wonderful. It sounds like tapestry of a lot of research proposals, and it's great to appreciate the tapestry as a form of integration, which I promote in every class that I'm teaching this semester. So why don't I I mean, so I would like to do next year." And he said, "Oh, we have a spot so for you. Okay, go for it." So I did it really in a hurry. But so this is part of my book project with Lexington Publishing Company entitled Death, DATH, and the Aesthetic Sublime, the comparative studies. So I study death from philosophical perspective, especially for the aesthetical perspective. I'm specializing in philosophy of art. And philosophy of art has a lot to do with its experiences. So I do philosophy of mind, and I do study them from comparative perspectives. So I do Eastern philosophy as well, especially Buddhism, Hinduism. So this is part of my project, long-term project, and my presentation is about my personal conundrum that studied everything ever since I was a college student. So the conundrum about aesthetic emotions goes like this. So emotions in general motivate our actions. So neuroscientists call them action potential. Oh, sorry, there's a typo. See, I was in a hurry. Action potentials. But while aesthetic emotions, the emotions that we feel towards a variety of aesthetic objects like artworks, nature, and anything that is relevant in evoking some special emotions. These aesthetic emotions accompany a uniquely pleasing experiences. So aesthetic emotions always come with some type of pleasures. And there are different names for those pleasures depending on the philosophers. Pleasure is a very positive, pleasing experiences, and also sublime is also very intense pleasure, but it's not positive, it's very negative pleasure. Because sublime is based on experiences of terror or fear. So, summing up, emotions in general motivate actions, but aesthetic emotions are treated as contemplative and very disinterested types of emotions. Now, then what explains the powerful effect is that emotions have an actions and intentions and other facets of practical endeavors as an individual, at an individual level as well as social level. So that was my conundrum about aesthetic emotions. So my argument that I want to present in my project is that aesthetic, among all the varieties of aesthetic emotions, I consider sublime as the most powerful aesthetic emotion. So as the most powerful aesthetic emotion, it evokes intense pleasure, but not positive, but negative pleasure. So what is negative pleasure is a big part of the project. And I employ one of the modern philosophers to explain the nature of this negative emotion, intense pleasure, but negative kind. So the sublime as the most powerful emotion can not only engender profound pleasure, but also mobilize strong intentions and actions, especially in the direction of relieving a lot of afflictions and sufferings that we always experience in our life. So so as an interlude, my book project, Death and Aesthetic Sublime, has to do with kind of catalyzing, or kind of, I should say, alchemizing the pervasive human sufferings, culminating in human death, in terms of aesthetic emotions. Whether we are able to, or capable of alchemizing or transforming those suffering experiences that we usually call sufferings into some type of aesthetic delight, in a negative sense. Negative sense, not in the sense that they are bad or they are very kind of objects of aversion or avoidance, but they started out very, very strong, kind of terrible experiences, fearful. We all afraid about those experiences. We all have some aversion towards it, but maybe there's a way to transform those pervasive suffering experiences into something aesthetically pleasing in sublime sense. That's aesthetic delight. So I employ 18th century British philosopher Edmund Burke, who is famous for his book, Inquiry About Our Experience of Sublime and Beautiful, and he's very influential in the study of sublime even today. And there's a lot of revival of his philosophical treatise about sublime among scholars these days. So, quote from his book, "When danger or pain," so this explains sublime as a negative pleasure. It's a pleasure but the negative sort. "When danger or pain press too nearly, they are incapable of giving any delight. We have to find ways to, we have to fly, we have to flee, and are simply terrible. But at certain distances and with certain modifications, they may be and they are, delightful, as we everyday experience." Another quote from the same book: "I'm convinced we have a degree of delight, and that no small one, in the real misfortunes and pains of others. Creator has designed we should be united by the bond of sympathy. He has strengthened that bond by a proportionable delight, and they're most where our sympathy is most wanted. In the distress of others, the delight we have in such things hinders us from shunning scenes of misery. And with the pain we feel prompts us to relieve ourselves in relieving those who suffer." So this sounds very puzzling, and I don't want to delve into too much because I know time's already up. So when we experience suffering and pain, terror in ourselves or in others, when we are facing too close, then we can't really enjoy that, appreciate that. But if we keep a little distance, it's not just physical distance, but some kind of psychical distance, and that's transformative practice. That creating a space between the terrible event and our own appreciation. That's what I mean by alchemizing or kind of catalyzing. So, and that capacity to have a space so that we can aesthetically appreciate the suffering in terms of delight, that like a joy. A lot of scholars can tell that kind of pleasure, joy. Then, using that process, we can develop kind of compassionate heart, so that we can be more understanding and empathizing and maybe do something actively to help out and relieve those sufferings. So that's my project. So it started out very contemplative aesthetic emotions, but at the bottom line, it has very kind of practical implications because that's where I came from as a young Marxist, as a college student, and I always kind of bothered by those aesthetic emotions. You know, it's such a delightful, such a rewarding experience, but I don't have to be like I don't have to be stuck in some kind of private area. I can use that energy and delightful experiences to do something outside in the world, full of sufferings. I think that's my project.
Thank you so much, Jung. Next up, Amalia Medina Castañeda, University Archivist, presenting La Casa de Castelar, Settlement Women, Librarians, and the quote-unquote Mexican Problem, 1896 to 1916.
All right, good evening, everyone. So I came to this research, so my background is in history and archival studies, and I came to this research sort of as a practitioner. So my research area is also diversity, racial and ethnic diversity, and archival and special collections librarianship. So in sort of thinking about the issue in a contemporary sense, I wanted to sort of dive into the history of the field, and I found some very, very interesting things in the records, early records of the American Library Association, and that's what this presentation is based on. And now this is like a new avenue of research for me. So the American Library Association was formed in 1876, so that's about a decade after the Civil War. So during this period, there was a huge rise in the establishment of public libraries. So prior to this, libraries were small, private, and were mostly run by men, and reserved for those considered intellectuals and serious readers. But that quickly began to change, and a wave of highly educated white women were graduating from colleges and looking for employment. The period here is a progressive era following the excesses of the Gilded Age and the Panic of 1893. It was a Protestant, white, highly educated, middle-class women who took the lead in this national-wide moral reform project. So to fight the ills of the industrial era, female reformers brought the settlement movement from London to Chicago, to the West, and to Los Angeles. The premise was that these women would literally settle and live among impoverished communities, primarily immigrants, and teach them the right Christian American way. The reformers sought Sonora Town, a Mexican enclave, to create the first settlement house that started as a college settlement and was eventually called Casa de Castelar. So let's zoom out for a bit and sort of think about the context here, right? So in this period, Los Angeles was founded as a white utopia, so an opportunity to sort of start fresh, right? Remove, and for Anglos to remove themselves from the ills of the Midwest and the East and the slums and all that came with the industrialization. So this was a chance to build an all-white city. So the influx of Mexican migrants fleeing the Mexican Revolution, between 1910 and 1920, and migrating to Los Angeles really upset Anglos in the region. So hence the term, the Mexican problem. So Mexicans were considered, next slide. Mexicans were considered dirty, unhygienic, and disease-ridden. But the settlement were eager to help solve this problem. Social workers soon began to train librarians and invite them to the settlement houses along with nurses and teachers. While the LA Public Library's formal history doesn't recognize it as such, the first lending station small branch was at the settlement house, and it was intended to serve Mexican children and prove that they could in fact learn. The Castelar branch was not a mere station for books. Rather, it embodied how librarians' outreach to immigrants was primarily about patronizing Americanization programs and curriculums. So why does this matter, right? Why do the librarians matter? Well, the American Library Association is an institution. It was not a benevolent organization. Librarians are widely written out of LA history, as my research has shown, and of the history of Mexican-American education in Los Angeles. Sometimes they don't even make the index, right? In a lot of the scholarship in early LA history. They're just librarians, right? They deliver books and services, but of course not, right? They were not, nor are they neutral. They were a significant constituency and played a huge role in educating communities and children. Libraries are institutions that profess their white supremacist ideals very openly throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, as the records of ALA clearly show. In librarianship, white women were able to express unchallenge their self-image, and freely project assimilationist ideals to the marginalized people they served. Currently, the field is grappling with how this has persisted into the 21st century. Librarians did not exist, nor do they exist in a vacuum. They were professionals who interacted with nurses, social workers, teachers, health officials, and businessmen. And this research highlights how they did contribute to the rhetoric and policies that ultimately pushed for the segregation of Mexican American children in Los Angeles. And they went on to enact harmful Americanization programs that started at the onset of World War I and persisted through the first half of the 20th century. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amalia. Next up, Nestor Garza, Assistant Professor in the Accounting, Finance, and Economics Department, presenting High-Rise Construction, Zoning, and Land Values in the Long Run, the case of Bogota, Colombia.
Okay, my name is Nestor Garza. I'm Assistant Professor in the College of Business. I teach economics. This paper has been the result, or this paper in process has been the result of a happy coincidence. The coincidence is that during years I have been accumulating appraisals of land values in the city of Bogota. They are as old as the 1960s. I have data from 1960 to 2010. During all that time, I have been performing research for more recent periods, for the period of the 90s and the 2010s, in particular the effect of regulation and taxation on land markets. But turns out a colleague of mine contacted me and told me, hey, I have been collecting high-rise construction and planning information for this city all the way back to 1960. We can fusion together with what we have been doing. Before, I didn't want to enter this topic of long-run analysis of land markets. Why? Because there is a geographical problem there. The geographical problem of modifiable areal unit problem. What is that? Cities are dynamic. What you call urban fabric today is not what it was 10 years ago or 20 years ago, and much less a century or half a century ago. Therefore, what you call urban today was rural yesterday. The only way to deal with that problem is to create a model able to predict back the values when the areas were rural with the urban information you have. This is what we have done. And perhaps we can show with this little thing. What we have done is we take all the information on land values from the period since 1960 to 2010. I show you here, for example, one of the possible years, 2010. On top of that, I locate construction. Here I have all the buildings, for example, of the period 2000-2010. All the buildings they had more than 10 stories. More than 10 stories high is about 43 meters high. But all the heights go from 43 to around 200 meters, which is buildings between 40 or 50 floors. So you have all types of buildings in those categories. These funny colors that you observe here are the planning decisions by the city in 1960, in 1970, in 1980, in 1990, in 2000. And then I create the entire structure and unify them both with this structure. This structure that you see here are accorded to the land values that are already collected by sons. I take it all back with my model and create this series, this long-term series of land values and of high-rise construction. And then I start my analysis. So far, what have we done? We have estimated the structure or the spatial structure of land values in the city. I realize this directional gradient is so far the best structure. Directional gradient is this idea. You have a surface of values which is segregated in one section. In urbanism, we call that the high rent cone. High income groups segregate themselves to the higher part of the city and break down the structure of the surface of the values. So I take that one with the corresponding extra section, and then I realize that the relationship between number of stories and land values is positive, and not just positive. It goes from the buildings to the land, the way the Marxian urban land economics theory predicted it should be. Why is this important? Because modern real estate analysis dismiss that part. They just don't enter there. Some economists who have made long-run analysis of land values and high-rise construction in cities like Chicago or New York, they focus on the real estate issue that they're related, and they stop there. I don't stop there. I go further and say, yes, they're related, positively related, and the relationship goes from the height or from the building to the land. And why is that important? Because proving that proves that land is a residual, that land doesn't produce anything, and that the total value or economic value that society uses on cities is the construction, which gives the city freedom to engage, for example, with progressive land policies. If you're not able to say that, then real estate analysts are going to tell you that it's impossible and that we shouldn't touch the real estate sector, and that the only thing to do there is to give subsidies to developers, for example. So I go all the way and say, no, it corresponds with what the theory predicts, and that's where we are right now. Right now I have obtained already these outputs. These are partial outputs. I plan to improve my outputs. I plan to improve the model that corrects the land series, but so far the results seem to be showing what I had in mind they were going to show in the beginning. Thank you.
Thank you, Nestor. Sorry. Next up, Kai Green, Assistant Professor of Special Education, presenting Spanish-English bilingual preschoolers code mixing patterns based on ability, frequency, accuracy, and semantic category.
Hello, thank you for being here. So, give you a little context. For years, I worked in LA Unified School District as a bilingual educator and eventually as a speech pathologist. And I got a little frustrated seeing so many English language learners, specifically Spanish-English bilinguals, being over-identified for special education services. And a lot of it had to do with the types of measurements that were used to determine if a student had language disorder and was eligible for special ed. So I went back to do a PhD about 15 years ago in clinical research at UT Austin in communication sciences and disorders. And I was really fortunate because my advisors had a huge grant to develop the first bilingual English-Spanish assessment that's normed on bilingual children. So this is part of that test. There's tests in English and Spanish across semantics, morphosyntax, and pragmatics and phonology. So I looked at a real small sliver of the semantics test, and so I looked at code mixing. So students, or those that are bilingual, will know often will switch from one language to another in discourse. This is specific to a testing task where they answer a one-word response. So it's just looking at code mixing in that context. And it really helps us better understand that bilingual mind of emerging bilinguals. These are preschoolers, as maybe you can't see so on the picture, having the concept in their head, and that would be the semantic representation, but the lexical choice that they make. So this gives us a little window into the world of emerging bilinguals and that language contact phenomena. So my questions really were looking at code mixing serve as a strategy that students learn even at preschool to respond to a vocabulary task, and also the categorical items. And so this test looks at a little more depth in semantic categories, and the categories included taxonomic category, which is, name 3 animals you know, versus a slot filler category, name 3 farm animals that you know, linguistic function, mostly verb items, and then also linguistic concepts that are kind of a catch-all category. So the first phase of this test, I had 600 subjects, and about half of them code mixed at least once in either English or Spanish. And we also put them in different ability levels based on their performance of the 4 screening tasks. If they scored below the mean on 3 of the 4 semantic tasks, we consider them to be at risk, perhaps for language delays or language developmental disorder. And the other group wasn't really considered a risk category. And so there's so many variables in this. I have probably, a minute left. So I just really looked at ability level and the different percentage correct based on the taxonomic category. And if you can see the results there, the purple are the not at risk group, and the orange, I guess it is, are the at risk group. So overall, you can see barely the different categories that are there, and these were the shared items across the Spanish and English tasks. Overall, with the purple bar, you can see that the participants code mixed more and more successfully from English to Spanish than Spanish to English. And the not risk group was more successful across most of all tasks on both Spanish and English screeners. And the students code mixed more on the taxonomic category over the slot filler category within and between languages. So again, that taxonomic is the more general semantic category, and the slot filler would be more of a specific category. So this gives us a little window into early language development for bilingual children. All the years I worked in schools, administrators, teachers, parents would say, oh, my child speaks English and switches into Spanish, or vice versa. They're confused. They don't really have any language, and is really sort of a deficit model of looking at emerging language development. Francois Grosjean is a great bilingual educational psychologist, and kind of sums that up with, bilinguals are not two monolinguals in one. So we have to look at them very differently in terms of how they develop their languages consecutively. And so this gives us, again, a little window into that world. And so the next task is to really look at the phase 2 and phase 3 of this data, where there's 1,200 subjects, and look in a little more depth of not just if they code mixed one time, but if some were very successful, if they code switched on all of the responses to the task or on just a few, and see how ability level and also proficiency level we counted for the subjects based on a family interview and their current and past use based on a percentage of English and Spanish. So if they were more like a Spanish dominant bilingual, or a balanced bilingual, or an English dominant bilingual based on a 60-40 paradigm, I guess. So my next goal, I came up just after Bogota, so I'm fortunate to be in a group of, a world group, I guess, global group of people from Spain, Latin America, and the United States that study language disorders in Spanish-speaking children. And so hopefully I'll get all this together next summer. We're gonna meet in Bogota.
Thank you so much, Kai. So miraculously, we're still pretty much on time somehow. So we're going to take a quick break now until our final presentations. I do have some bad news. We only have 4 presentations left. So I know. we had a few people drop out last minute, unfortunately. So we're going to actually, when we get back together, we're going to go ahead and do the last 4 in a row, so we don't have to take any extra time in between. But then there would be time if anyone wants to wing some stand-up research presentation. No, there'll be some time afterwards to mingle as well. So we're going to take a quick break now, and then the next presentation will be at 7:05. All right, welcome back, everyone. We're going to head into the final stretch here. Again, just 4 presentations to go, so really savor them. Starting off the final stretch, we have Hal Weary, Assistant Professor of Music, and he'll be presenting Building Generational Wealth Through Intellectual Property. And he's the only one with 3 slides tonight, so give him a hand.
I know I snuck in a title slide, sorry. I was like, does this really count or? Okay, so thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. And this research is one of the many areas of focus that is really, I would say, near and dear to me, very passionate about. So I wear many different hats in the music department. So my experience is also as a jazz pianist and composer, but I also worked in the music industry for quite some time. And prior to working in higher education, I worked for a company called the Harry Fox Agency. Any of you heard of the Harry Fox Agency? This particular company has been around for almost about 100 years, since 1927. And the primary focal point of the Harry Fox Agency, or what they do, is music licensing. And it's really the epicenter of intellectual property as it pertains to musical copyrights, things of that nature. And one thing that I found to be intriguing in the music industry is that I've found that intellectual property a lot of times can be very transformative. Transformative in the way of musically from a creative standpoint, and also transformative of how it has transformed the lives of many generations because of the complexity and how things have evolved a great deal in the music world as it pertains to copyrights and other forms of intellectual property. So what is intellectual property? As you can see here, intellectual property, ideas translated from creators' minds to tangible expressions such as songs, writing, and other forms. Okay, so that's what we look at. So when we look at the creation of art, these things start in the mind and then many times become fixed in some type of medium. And the particular mediums that we look at would be in streams or sound recordings. When we look at copyright law, it's interesting that the first copyright law in the US was in 1909 and was 56 years. And then later became extended in 1976 in the 1976 Copyright Act, and was life of the author plus an additional 50 years. So the life, and then after the death of the author, you have an additional 50 years. Copyright Termination Extension Act of 1998 extended the copyright an additional 20 years. And it's interesting, and one of the, some of my favorite collaborators, do you guys remember Sonny and Cher? Sonny Bono and Cher. Well, Sonny Bono was really a proponent of extending copyright. And it's interesting, in one of the books that I use in one of my classes, there's a chapter called I Got You 20, Babe, which came from the song I Got You, Babe. So he petitioned for perpetuity, and perpetuity means basically forever in a contract. But we didn't get perpetuity, but we got somewhere in between. So we got an additional 20 years. So we're now at life of the author plus an additional 70 years. So when we look at copyright law, many times after a artist has passed away, you have a songwriter or a composer, you have these estate transfers that allow for the estate transfer to be able to be managed by the owner of the actual estate, which there creates generational wealth after the life of the actual author. Something that was really transformative in copyright law was the Music Modernization Act of 2018. And this really extended copyright into the digital age. As we look at now, we're into the world of streaming. And with streaming, you know, it's not extremely lucrative. a stream, if you stream something on Spotify or one of the digital service providers, it's typically only going to be what's called a micro penny, which would be 0.001385 something. And for an artist, that's not very lucrative. It's really difficult for an artist to really sustain a long, sustainable career with just money that's made from specific streams and things of that nature. So now there's this major focus on intellectual property. And how do artists and musicians and people even outside of the arts protect and have a knowledge of how to, effectually really create art or things outside of art that can very much create generational wealth over a long period of time, and creating something outside of these streams that can be not as lucrative or sustainable, okay? So other forms of intellectual property, there are four specific forms or primary forms of intellectual property. One would be copyrights, you have trademarks, patents, and trade secrets. And in the arts, for the most part, all of these areas of focus can be very much beneficial. One thing that I've found with copyright is that many songs can be used in infinite ways, right? When you fly on an airplane, when you walk on an airplane, you hear music. When you go to a grocery store, you hear music. It's in your car, it's on your phone, it's in theme parks, it's everywhere you go. But alongside that would be the trademark, and being able to strengthen the trademark and creating the brand, building the brand and things of that nature. Patents are also important as far as the specific patents that are built. And as you can see, many artists are becoming more and more diversified and have a variety of different aspects to their careers. Record labels got smarter, and they created these contracts which are called 360 deals. And in order to be able to recoup certain monies, advances that they give artists, a lot of times they want to delve into many aspects of these intellectual property rights. So my research really focuses on how to maximize and to protect and to be able to efficiently understand the moving components of copyright really in the 21st century. It's become more and more complex, but it's at the centerpiece of the music industry and the music business as a whole. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Hal. Next up, Elise Freeman, Assistant to the Dean of the University Library, presenting The Prevalence of Physical Inactivity and Low Back Pain in Sedentary Office Employees, a Survey Analysis. I sat up straight when I read the title earlier. I'm already feeling it.
All right, hello everyone. So just as Ken said, my name is Elise. So some of you may know me as a staff member, and that is exactly what I am. However, I am also a recent graduate. So I just received my master's degree this spring, so I'm very excited about that. Thank you all. So what I have here is just basically my thesis, and I'm excited to also announce that actually my abstract just got accepted by the International Journal of Exercise Science. So I'm very proud to know that it will be published in the November edition. So that's something else I'm very proud of. Thank you all. So with that, I want to just present to you all my research and also my future research interests, because although I am the assistant to the dean in the library, I very much so want to transition into what I would like to do for my career path, which is actually teach. So it's really an honor to be amongst all of you here and to have you all listen to me and be able to listen to all of you all. So with that being said, so the prevalence of physical inactivity in low back pain and sedentary office employees. So it was a survey analysis, and it may actually sound familiar to some of you all because the survey may have landed in your inbox. And so it did circulate around campus just a little bit, and so thank you if you did take it. And if you did not know about it, no worries whatsoever. But in this, I looked at three things. So I looked at the prevalence of the prevalence of low back pain in sedentary office employees. I looked at physical activity habits within sedentary office employees. And I also looked at a third thing, which is comparing low back pain prevalence against, low back pain prevalence against exercise volume and exercise type. So with that, I have my results here. And so I have it highlighted in 2 bullet points, and the third one I kind of, for time's sake purposes, throw into the conclusion. So what I found is that 73.7% of participants experienced some level of low back pain when seated at work. And so when we look at this, my survey population, just so you know, was 164 people in total, but it boiled down from 272. After I excluded all my criteria, it came down to 164. So of that, that's how we get these numbers of 73.7. And so of this population, 66% do use ergonomic chairs. And as you know, many of you may have ergonomic chairs in your office now. So it doesn't really imply so much that ergonomic chairs are a make or break type of deal, because still 66% of employees still had some type of low back pain. The second thing I looked at, again, talking about physical activity, is that what I like to emphasize is on the latter part of this, is that only 7.9% were actually active, and only 1.8% were considered highly active in accordance with the physical activity guidelines for Americans. And so to break that down, that just basically says what we all commonly know today that our doctors talk about, moderate intensity physical activity of doing about 5 days, 30 minutes a day for 5 days a week, and then also including about 2 days of resistance training. And as you can see, we're not pretty active. So we all do have to step our game up in that area. And then what I have nestled into the conclusion is this next part. So I will focus on the bold, which is that low back pain was still prevalent in most participants despite their engagement in physical activity. Now, this is just a side note. My personal thought is that part of the reason why this likely is because even if we do hit the moderate intensity guidelines for exercise, that's only about 30 minutes a day. Even if you do exercise for about an hour, you're always going to be sitting a lot more than that. So it's not going to be so much a remedy to low back pain. Now, my study didn't necessarily conclude this, but this is just some background information that I think and want to help encourage you all to also think about as well as you continue your sedentary habits. So with that as well, I want to get into some of the background about myself, what makes me interested in this, and my future research interests. So I'm interested in it because I too am a sedentary office employee. But in addition to that, when we look at this as a population, we have Americans, right? So within this, 4 in 10 Americans are physically inactive or spend about 8 hours or greater of their day seated. Now, when it comes to my survey, this actually doubled. So it's about 16.2 hours that my survey population actually said. And so when you think about this, take away the pandemic, think about it from the pandemic aspect, and then even insert the pandemic, right? So a lot of people begin to sit more, they're at home more, but even if you take that scenario out of the equation, we still have very high sitting habits. So I also looked at recreation sitting. So when you're at home, when you're sitting on the couch, when you're driving, when you're commuting from Corona, from Compton, from Torrance, wherever the case may be, all this equals to an amassed amount of time spent seated. Now, when we break that down a little further, I have another interest, which is college students, because I too was a college student. And so college students' daily sitting time increases significantly from their freshman year to their senior year. So when you think about that, you then begin to factor them into the American population. Once they get out of school, they get into whatever accounting position they received, whatever IT position they received. They're just pretty much like the rest of us. However, they are a unique population that I'm also interested in. But even more than that, another population I'm interested in is esports players. So I am interested in gaming. I've always done it recreationally as like a kid, and even now it's kind of like one of those stress reliever things. And so there is something to note that there is a difference between gaming and esports players. So many of us may consider ourselves gamers, right? Because gamers are the population that use their phones to play mobile games, just to